All right, we've spent quite a bit of time in the earlier videos going over revenues, going over costs, talking about how to represent those in graphs. And that's all been leading up to the perfectly competitive model of a market, okay? Which turns out this part of the lecture is probably going to be one of the fastest parts. Now that we've got all of the building blocks, it should be pretty quick to put them together and show you how it works in a graph. So in a perfectly competitive market, it has four characteristics to it that are important that drive the dynamics of the model. Okay, the first two of these characteristics are going to make it very difficult, or rather impossible, for any firm to charge a price that is above the market clearing price. So the first of those is, for a market to be perfectly competitive, there has to be a large number of buyers and sellers. How large is large? Okay, well, large, when economists use that phrase to refer to a perfectly competitive market, it just means there needs to be enough buyers and enough sellers so that no buyer can push the price down on his or her own, and no sellers can push the price up on his or her own. There has to be enough of these that if one of them tries to adjust their output, adjust their quantity, that doesn't have a big enough impact on the market as a whole to push the price up or down. The buyers and the sellers in a perfectly competitive market are what we would call price takers. Okay, they're not actively setting prices. They're sort of passively looking at what the price is that's generated by the market and just going along with that price. The second characteristic is that the sellers in this market need to be selling homogeneous products. Homogeneous is just a fancy word for saying all the same. Okay, homogenized milk is milk that has been that has the milk fat evenly spread throughout the entire glass of milk. So what that means is they're not selling a product where you can differentiate what you're selling from what a competitor is selling. So this isn't Dell laptops versus Apple laptops. Okay, it's not Nikes versus Adidas. Homogeneous products are products where you cannot tell the difference between what one seller is selling you and what another seller is selling you. So this could be things like bushels of wheat or barrels of oil or tons of steel. Okay, so the products are homogeneous. Put those two things together, and what that means is every firm is going to have to just accept the market clearing price. You cannot raise your price above your competitors, for one thing, because you're selling exactly the same thing that they are. And so if your customers see you selling at a price that's a penny higher than your competitors, they're just going to prefer to go purchase from a competitor instead. And more than that, there's a large number of competitors. There's a lot of sellers out there. And so it's easy for your consumers to find your competitors and just walk across the street and make the purchase over there. There aren't big costs of searching and finding somebody else if you're charging a higher price than they are. All right, so those are the first two characteristics. The second two have to do with the ability of other firms or other individuals to come into the market and start competing with you if you are making an economic profit in this market. So those are the following. First of all, information on costs and prices is widely available. So entrepreneurs who are not currently competing with you can easily access information on how much does it cost to do business in this market. What are the prices that I could sell my product for? Okay, that information is widely available, so they can tell if there is an economic profit being made in the market. And finally, there needs to be, in order for this market to be perfectly competitive, there needs to be free entry into the market and a free exit out of the market, which means that if there are a lot of profits being made in the market, there's no big regulatory hurdles for these firms to get through if they want to come in and start competing with you. There's no big, financial cost of sinking a bunch of money into starting a business to compete with you. Or at the very least, if they would have to sink all that money in, they can easily recoup that money. So there's no big exit cost. All right. Free entry and exit means that firms have an easy time coming in and competing as soon as there are profits, and they have an easy time leaving as soon as there are economic losses, or if there are economic losses. Okay, so those four characteristics hold in a perfectly competitive market. And now we're going to go through the graphs of a perfectly competitive market and talk about where does the market settle in the long run. So when you're talking about firms in a perfectly competitive market, it's important that you split your analysis between what's happening at the market level and what is happening at the firm level. Now, the y-axes of these two graphs are on the same scale. Okay, the price here is going to be whatever the number is over here. That's going to translate exactly into the dollar terms on the y-axis for the firm. But the quantities, the x-axes, are not the same. This large Q is referring to the quantity of units that gets produced by the entire market, whereas this lowercase q is referring to how much output gets produced by this particular firm. Okay, so this is at a smaller scale than that is. All right, so you've got your market, you've got supply and demand, and their intersection is going to determine that market clearing price. We're all familiar with this. Okay, I'm going to call that price P1. Now, there's a large number of buyers and a large number of sellers in this market, and so they're all trading at this price P1. They all take that price P1. And you could go through, a couple of I don't know, mental exercises on trying to think about why might the sellers not be able to push these prices up. Okay, you could say, well, if I'm a seller, why don't I try to reduce my output? And if I reduce my output, I can shift that supply curve to the left and push up the price that the buyers are going to have to pay me. Problem with that is you are such a small player here that even if you reduce your output by 100%, you're not going to be able to shift that supply curve by enough to raise the price by any appreciable amount. So you can't do it on your own. Then you could say, all right, well, maybe I could get together with other sellers, and in coordination, we will all reduce our supply at the same time. Then we could shift this supply curve up and to the left and push that price up. Okay, fair enough. If you did that, if you formed what is called a cartel of firms, you might be able to reduce output all at the same time. The problem is cartels with a large number of firms have a lot of difficulty sticking together and keeping prices up. Because here's the problem. Let's say you had, let's say there's 100 firms in this market, and all 100 of you get together and say, we're going to cut our output by, let's say, 15% and shift this supply curve up, and hopefully then we'll push the price up by more than 15%. All right. Well, the problem is if you're one of those firms, you know that if you keep producing 100% of your output while everybody else reduces their output by 15%, well, then this supply curve is going to push the price up by almost exactly the same amount as it would if you cut your production along with them. So in the back of your mind, you're thinking, you know what? I could make more profit if I just keep producing as much as I want to, and I let everybody else cut their output by 15%. The problem is everybody else has exactly those same incentives. This is called a prisoner's dilemma, where all the firms in the cartel could do better if they all cooperated with each other, but individually they can do better by not cooperating with each other. Okay, or what you would, I suppose a better way of saying that is, if everybody else is cooperating, you're better off not cooperating. And if everybody else is not cooperating like you are, then you're also better off not cooperating. You don't want to be the one sucker firm that cuts your output, okay, because then you're not going to capture any gains from a price increase. So those cartels tend to break down, and shifting the supply curve around is not a viable option when you've got so many competitors in this perfectly competitive market. You might also say, okay, well, maybe instead of shifting the supply curve, maybe I could do something like advertise this product to consumers and shift the demand curve up and to the right. Because if I can do that, then I'll push the price up, and I'll push the quantity up in this market as well. So I might be able to profit doing that. The problem is what you are selling is a homogeneous product. Okay, maybe you're selling apples, let's say, and you're selling apples that a whole bunch of other competitors are selling exactly the same variety and the consumers can't tell the difference. Problem is, if you advertised your product, then you are incurring the expense of that advertisement. However, when all of the consumers see your advertisement, they just know, oh, I should buy more apples. They have a desire to purchase more apples than they did before. Well, there's no guarantee that they're going to buy those apples from you. They're probably going to buy a lot of them from your competitors. And so while, yes, you might be able to shift this demand curve up and get a higher price, the problem is you paid a whole bunch of money to make that happen. Your competitors who didn't pay money to make it happen, they capture most of the benefits of that price increase. And so once again, you've got this prisoner's dilemma where you're better off not advertising whether or not your competitors are advertising as well. You'll notice that where we see advertisements, or at least most advertising dollars go, they are for products that can be differentiated. They're for things like McDonald's versus Burger King. There's a difference between those two products. And so each firm can try to entice customers towards their version of the product. You do not typically see advertisements for things like fresh fruits and vegetables, things that haven't been processed as food. Okay, so supply and demand, we're going to take them as fixed, at least in the short run. There's nothing that the individual firms can do to shift those around. Okay, so you've got this price. What does that look like on the firm side? Well, if we take that price, that is going to create the marginal revenue for the firm. This is the firm's marginal revenue curve. And it is also the firm's demand curve. From the firm's perspective, this marginal revenue, this price, is equal to their demand curve, which just tells you that they can supply any number of units they want to along this demand curve. If they raise their price at all, then immediately consumers are not going to want to buy any product from them. On the other hand, they could drop their price below the marginal revenue, in which case they could sell, say an infinite number of units, but they can already sell their profit maximizing level of units at this price, at this marginal revenue. And so they have no reason to price below that demand curve. So they have perfectly elastic demand. Okay, now what is the firm going to do? Well, the firm's going to want to produce the number of units where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. We covered that in the earlier video. They're going to want to produce this number of units, Q1. And at that price, you'll notice that the average total cost per unit is down here. The marginal revenue per unit is up there. And so this is their profit per unit. And this, the area of this rectangle here, represents the firm's total profits. Okay? And those are economic profits, which means they're earning, by economic profits, remember what we're doing is we're subtracting the opportunity costs out from the accounting profits. We're assuming that this marginal cost and average total cost curve include the firm's opportunity costs. So the fact that they're earning profit means, economic profit means they're making more money in this market than they could earn anywhere else, doing anything else. So these economic profits, they're like super profits. They're larger than normal profits. Okay. Now, what is that going to do? Well, if you're earning economic profits, remember that firms in other markets, entrepreneurs who aren't currently competing with you, they can see those profits. Okay, this is like blood in the water to them. That's going to attract more firms into the market. As those firms get attracted into the market, remember that one of the determinants of supply is the number of firms, the number of competitors. More firms means more supply. So as those firms come in and start competing with you, they're going to be shifting the supply curve down and to the right. So let's suppose that on the first iteration of this, you get some more competitors. those competitors shift this supply curve from S1 to S2, notice that that's going to create a lower price. I'm not going to draw that price out to the y-axis here, but I am going to bring it over to the firm's level. So now notice that you've got this second marginal revenue curve, marginal revenue 2. That is a new demand curve for them. And whereas before the firms were earning all of this economic profit between the average total cost curve and the marginal revenue curve, now they're earning a smaller amount. Now, technically speaking, marginal cost intersects marginal revenue here at a slightly lower level of output. So this quantity Q1 would actually drop a little bit, but I'm going to ignore that just to make this graph a little bit cleaner to look at. Once those new firms have entered the market, that incumbent firm is no longer earning this entire amount of economic profit. Instead, they're earning this smaller amount of economic profit down here. All right, so new competition starts whittling away at the economic profit that you're facing. Now, the problem from the firm's perspective is that since there are still economic profits in this market, that process of attracting new firms into the market has not stopped. Okay, they are going to keep on, as long as there's any economic profits, those economic profits are going to keep on attracting new firms into the market and pushing the price down until we reach the minimum of the average total cost curve, which is right here. Call that MR3 or demand curve 3. What that means is firms are going to keep on entering and pushing this supply curve down and to the right until they hit this point here where the price in the market is equal to the minimum of the average total cost curve. Call that S3. And you'd get this price right here. Oops. Call it P3. Okay. This price, where it finally reaches the point where there are no economic profits left in the market, that is where we expect the market to end up, okay, in the long run. If something happens that knocks a bunch of firms out of this market, suddenly a bunch of them go bankrupt for whatever reason, and supply shifts up, then you would expect new firms to enter because that supply shifting up pushes you up to a higher price, which creates economic profits. Those economic profits are going to encourage new firms to come into the market, and eventually they'll push that price down so that there are no economic profits left in the market. Or perhaps demand increases that pushes the price up. Well, in the long run, again, it's the minimum of the average total cost curve that's going to dictate how many firms can be in this market. And so even if demand goes up and pushes price up, supply is going to respond by coming down until the market price returns to the minimum of the average total cost. It works in reverse as well, by the way. If demand for this product suddenly shifted down and to the left, and we pushed the price down below the minimum of the average total cost, well, then firms are going to be making economic losses in this market. That means that there's at least one other thing they could be doing that makes them more money than operating in this market. So if that demand curve fell and the price dropped below MR3 here, then some firms would start exiting in response to their economic losses, and that would shift the supply curve back to the left, which would start pushing the price back up, and you would end up again in a position in the long run where the equilibrium price was at the bottom of the average total cost curves. So that brings us to just a quick summary of what's going on in a perfectly competitive market. here's kind of the important information. First of all, demand for each firm is perfectly elastic. They're price takers. Whatever the market price is, they treat that as their demand curve, and that's their marginal revenue. There's widely available information on profits and losses in this market, and whenever there are profits, that's going to attract new firms, which drives the price down, okay? And that process is only going to stop, the process of new firms entering is only going to stop once economic profit equals zero. Now, I want to remind you and point out, economic profit equaling zero doesn't mean these firms are going bankrupt. It means that when you account for their opportunity cost, when you subtract out the profit that they could be earning in their next best alternative, that number is equal to zero. Okay, they're making as much profit in this market as whatever their next best alternative is. This situation of firms earning economic profit of zero, that only occurs where the price or the marginal revenue is equal to the minimum of the average total cost curve. All right, so that's it for this model. I've got just a couple more videos to post up where we talk about firms' decision to enter the market and exit the market, and I'll put those up shortly.